Hey GMAT Club, NonYankee here. I want to talk a little bit about how to prep for the GMAT. First, I suggest you take a practice test using GMAT's own GMAT Prep software. This is going to be the most realistic assessment you can get of where you currently stand. Once you know your current score, it'll help you determine what's a realistic target score. And that'll depend on how much time you have before you want to apply. If you only have a month before you want to apply to business schools, you might not be able to improve by 400 points. Maybe something like 50 or 100. It depends on how much you study. Next, how do you prepare? I suggest using the official guides and the problem sets that are available on GMAT Club. When I use the official guide, I would do 40 problems of the same type, all in a row, without timing myself. I was shooting for understanding. Now, if you have problems with timing, then by all means, practice solving problems in timed conditions. But I would only do this once you understand the concepts that are being tested. Lastly, don't forget that GMAT is just a test, and it's just one part of the process to getting into business school. And even business school is not the destination. Remember that business school is just a bridge to your goals. So don't get too hung up on one specific score or one specific business school, because there are a lot of different ways that you can reach your goals. I got my first rejection just yesterday despite having a really strong GMAT score. So don't despair, you can always reach your goals as some other way. Good luck out there.
Hello GMAT Club. I'm going to share 2 GMAT time management tips with you. First tip. This is an easy way to know if you're ahead or behind time-wise on the quant section. As you probably already know, the standard speed for the quant section is 1 question every 2 minutes. To know how I was doing, I would check my time right before starting questions 8, 18, and 28. I chose these questions for a reason. For example, right before starting question 18, you have exactly 20 questions left. Therefore, if you're right on schedule, you should have 40 minutes left on your clock. Since this is a round number, you can know at a glance if you're ahead or behind on time and by how much. This way, you can keep tabs on time quickly and easily. My general time management strategy required me to keep close tabs on time. What I would do is try and never get into a position where I had less than 2 minutes per question remaining. If, on the other hand, I was ahead by a couple minutes, I would consider that this time was available for me to spend whenever I found a particularly tough question. In essence, I tried not to spend extra time on a question before I had earned it. Second tip, there are many opinions out there about the importance of the first couple of questions, and some people say that you should spend more time on these questions than on the other ones. I'm going to give you my point of view on this. For those of you aiming to score high, I actually suggest you spend less time on these questions than on the other ones in the test. There are 2 reasons why I say this. The first is, if you're aiming high, the first questions will be the easiest ones you get on the whole test. The first questions are of average difficulty, and as you answer them correctly, they will get harder and harder until they reach your level. Since they're easier, I suggest you take advantage of this opportunity and try and win some time on them. The second reason is that winning some time on these questions fit in well with my general time management strategy. I tried to save a couple of minutes on these questions so that when I hit the 8 question mark, I already had some time saved up to spend on tough questions. So there you have it, my general time management strategy. To sum it up, get ahead early thanks to the easy questions at the beginning, keep close tabs on time by checking it on questions 8, 18, and 28, spend the extra time you saved up when you see a tough question, and try not to get into a situation where you have less than 2 minutes per question remaining. Good luck!
So I want to talk about this myth that the first 10 questions on the GMAT matter more. I don't think that they do, and I'm going to prove that to you, or I'm going to try to prove that to you in a few minutes. So the image you see here is pretty common. The theory goes something like this. You answer the first 4 questions right, and then you just have to get 1 or 2 right for every 1 or 2 wrong, right? That sounds pretty easy. Oh, I just got to get 1 right and 1 wrong, and 1 right and 1 wrong. I can do that. Now the bottom graph sounds hard, right? You get a first few wrong, but then you have to claw back up and you've got to get a whole bunch right in a row. And look, you don't even ever get back to the same score that you would have if you'd just gotten the first few questions correct. There's a lot wrong with this graph. For starters, why would it be any harder to get the last few questions right than the first few? If anything, tests are adaptive, right? So the questions become more difficult with each subsequent correct answer. Then really, the bottom line should be much easier to do than the top line. The whole idea that this could even occur is really predicated on a concept that you run out of time to quote-unquote catch up, and that your true score, and by true score here I mean your real ability, is never really obtained. Note also that this assumes that you get the same benefit from a right answer as you do the penalty from a wrong answer, and that's just not how adaptive tests work. Every question has its own probability distribution, and it assumes, the test calculates what it believes your ability to get the question right is. It then adjusts the subsequent question based on whether or not you did or didn't. The movement isn't simply 10 points plus, 10 points minus. It's a much more sophisticated algorithm than that. So that alone should convince you that the graph just simply isn't believable. But why does the myth even exist? It came from a paper that was written by two individuals back in the late 1990s, early 2000, I believe. The paper basically said that for a given true score of 650, answering the first questions resulted in, say, a 20 or 30 point increase. Great. So that would seem to suggest that the myth is true. But there was a number of things that the paper didn't assume or didn't consider which don't reflect reality. First of all, it assumed that all the other questions, after you've answered the first few correctly, were answered the same, whether you answered them correctly or incorrectly. In other words, getting the first two questions right didn't change the likelihood that the subsequent questions were answered incorrectly or correctly, and that time was simply not a factor in the decision-making process of whether or not those people got the next questions right. But of course, that's absolutely the opposite of how the GMAT works. By very definition, the last few questions would have been harder. And again, by the very definition, the probability of you getting the last few questions correct would have been lower than the exact same person getting those questions right had they not had the first few questions correctly answered. So answering the first few questions right will come at some cost, and that's, I think, what people forget. So for starters, imagine you have now harder questions coming at you, which if you really shouldn't be at that quote-unquote level, then odds are you're not going to get the harder questions right? You're going to have to rely on luck or taking additional time, which you don't have. Second, not only are the questions harder, but now you've eaten up more time on the first few questions. So now you find yourself in the not so envious position of having the privilege of having harder questions with less time to answer them correctly. The paper also showed that getting the first three questions right, again, and importantly, leaving all other subsequent answers untouched or unchanged, which is at best lucky, would give you a 10-point increase. For a given score, I think it was 720 or 750, something like that. But it also noted that getting the last three questions wrong resulted in a 20-point drop. So, ask yourself, do you really believe that getting the first three questions right wouldn't in any way impact your ability to get the last three right, particularly if you spend more time on the first few and the last ones are a little bit harder than they otherwise would have been?
Hi, my name is Mohammed. I'm Mohair in GMAT Club, and I'm here to talk to you today about the GMAT. Many people complain about the GMAT saying one of two primary things. Either one, it's a test that doesn't accurately reflect a person's skills, which may or may not be true, and two, it's a test that doesn't really matter. The first and foremost evidence of why both of those are inaccurate is graduate programs value, especially the highly competitive ones, value the GMAT. Some are beginning to accept the GRE scores, but they still really value GMAT scores. I've been fortunate enough to attend a number of conferences hosted by the GMAC, the General Management Admissions Council, the nonprofit that owns the GMAT. And after attending those, I realized that the test does really have a high value. And what we're going to cover today is three main things. The first thing is that the GMAT is a standardized test. So it doesn't matter where you take it. It doesn't matter who you are. The test is the same. What that does mean, however, is as certain scores skew upward, so will the distribution of those scores, or the normalization of those scores. So for example, verbal scores haven't changed too much. They have skewed upward slightly. But if you go to the GMAC's website, if you Google GMAC, they have a data analytics section, and you can see over time as more and more people from specific geographies, namely the Indian subcontinent and China, take the test, quant scores have shifted from here, wherever here is, to here. So previously, 48 was over 80 percentile on the score, and now it's a 49. And the highest score you can get is a 52. So that shows you the demographics are really shifting, that more people with higher quant skills are taking the test. The second thing I want to cover is that the test isn't designed to reflect your skill set. This test is designed for a couple main purposes. One, how well do you deal with specific problem-solving tasks in a heavily timed environment? And two, how well can you adapt to the difficulty of said problem? So the GMAT is the GMAT is an adaptive test. It gets harder as you do better, and as you do worse, it gets easier. And that's how the algorithm figures out your score. One thing to keep in mind here is schools want people to come in with a somewhat fixed set of skills, but they can't assume that everyone has, an accounting background or a finance background or a marketing background. So from a schoolwork perspective, the GMAT is not designed to cover any of those courses. What it is designed is to show that you are competent in very specific areas up to a certain level, and beyond that, it does nothing else. A lot of people report that, if I was given unlimited time, I could do much better, but then the test wouldn't really matter because everyone could possibly do better if they had unlimited time. The third thing I want to talk about is why you can do better. So the GMAT as a test is designed to basically find out your weaknesses and exploit it. It's an adaptive test. You get different questions from different sections, and your score is only as good as your weakest section. As such, you have a job to do as a test taker. You as a test taker have to figure out what are my weakest sections and what are the problems I need to do, or what do I need to develop to overcome them. At this stage in your life, you likely have a lot of tendencies that lead you to certain directions. So for example, if you're a native speaker of the English language and you think in improper grammar, you're most likely going to gravitate to improper grammar solutions because they sound right to you. If you're used to skipping steps in algebra and geometry, and that's more often than not led you to incorrect answers, you're likely to do that in the GMAT. And the problem is when you're reviewing problems and you read the solution, you might simply say, oh, that makes sense. But you're unable to apply the concepts in a future setting. And it's because you have these subconscious tendencies that you might not be aware of. A key to overcoming this is a tool called the error log. If you look it up on GMAT, you'll learn that an error log isn't simply a tracking of right or wrong. What it is it's a tool that's designed to help you track the why aspect of answering problems incorrectly. And once you figure out the why aspect, you become cognizant and aware of the problems you're answering incorrectly, and then you can overcome them. So for example, I took the GMAT twice, about a year and a half between both takes. The first time I took it, the actual test, I scored a 610. The second time I took it, I scored a 710. I did take a class, but after taking the class, I don't regret it. I don't regret taking the class at all. I found a great value in it. I learned a lot. The instructors were great, and a lot of my fellow classmates were great, even though it was virtual. There was still a lot of good interaction. But the key takeaway was I realized that I had these subconscious tendencies that were pushing me to incorrect answers. And through the class, I could not get over a 680. I kept scoring 680, 680, 680, 680. And it wasn't until I scheduled a session with the instructor, a virtual session where it was just organized feedback, that the instructor indicated to me, you are doing wrong here. This is what you keep doing wrong. And as an instructor, he was aware that people tend to gravitate to subconscious tendencies. That's when it clicked for me. That's when I figured out that there's something I'm doing that's routinely getting me to the incorrect answers. And then I took the test, and thankfully I scored a 710. You can overcome this. You can self-prep. But the key to doing that is you need to be aware of these things and you need to keep track of them over time. There's a lot of great resources out there. You just have to figure out how to exploit them.